Where does a poem begin? For me, a poem always begins, maybe not always, but sometimes, maybe occasionally, it begins with walking. I love being outside and would be outside as much as possible if I could. So a poem begins with my steps out in the air over, a lot of times, surfaces that don't really accept my feet easily. A poem can begin with a stumble. It's kind of a crazy thing to write a poem. It's brave in a weird way that doesn't seem very brave maybe to a lot of people. But to me it feels brave because it's actually moving forward and sharing something very private and very personal. Not that the work itself has to reflect a personal or the private, but there's something about sharing a poem and opening yourself up to creativity and letting yourself think about things in ways that maybe are different from a lot of what life is saying we have to be. A poem for me begins in refusal, not being willing to accept that the way I'm told life is supposed to be is about always focusing on what we have to buy. Look at all these books. Maybe a poem begins somewhere in these books, damaged by rain. Maybe a poem begins in art that people share. Maybe a poem begins in what is othered. Maybe a poem begins in that tree over there that you can't see but very well, but it's starting to be beautiful. Maybe a poem begins in a closed sidewalk. Maybe a poem begins in a piece of construction that isn't finished yet. Maybe it begins in those wires. Maybe it begins in the cyclist riding by. Maybe it begins with me and you sharing a moment. Maybe it doesn't begin at all sometimes. Maybe it just keeps just smoldering until it's ready to come out. Maybe a poem will tell you when it begins. I hope that the poem begins for you. Maybe a poem begins in transgressing boundaries and going where you're not allowed to go. In language, in life, in words. Maybe it begins in a shape of a letter, a shape of a word, a shape of a day, a shape of your feet. Maybe it begins in trying to keep going despite everything. Maybe a poem begins in practice, the constant attempt to do something regularly. Maybe a poem begins in ritual. Maybe a poem begins in play, just playing around and seeing what happens, jumping around, hanging off rainbow-colored rings. Maybe a poem begins in color. Maybe it begins with you. Maybe a poem begins in memory, remembering those that are dear to you and that are no longer with us today. Maybe a poem begins in the things that we throw away, that people throw away, that we rescue and we take into our language and into our thoughts. Maybe a poem begins in intricate patterns and looking closely. Maybe a poem can begin an engagement with what's around you, with the people in your community, and the work that is inspired in this community. Maybe a poem begins with saints. Maybe a poem begins in the spaces beneath bridges, transitional spaces where travel happens, where things change, where we go from one thing to another, one state to another, hunger, happiness, anxiety. Maybe a poem begins with movement. Maybe a poem begins with rot and what ends and then leads to a new beginning. Maybe a poem begins with startling discoveries, flowers made of paper, trying to emulate the spring, mimesis. Maybe a poem begins with texture. Can you feel this beautiful brick? Maybe a poem begins in a story, the secret story that you've always needed to tell, that you haven't yet told. Maybe a poem never begins. Maybe it's a circle that never starts and never ends. Maybe it just keeps going round and round. Maybe a poem begins in taking a rest and just looking around and close watching to see everything around. Maybe a poem begins out of sequence with time. Maybe a poem doesn't always fit at the beginning. Maybe a poem begins in the middle of action when you're not necessarily involved, but you know there are a lot of people involved in all kinds of business. Maybe the poem begins in queerness. Maybe the poem begins in difficult terrains and rocks that close up might share their secrets. Maybe the poem begins in the tearing down of the old and replacement with the new. Maybe the poem begins with a line. Maybe the poem begins in nature that refuses to be tamed and sprouts up in the most unlikely places. Maybe the poem begins in abundance instead of in scarcity. Maybe the poem begins in whimsy. Maybe the poem begins in a love of the earth and all the things that grow. Maybe the poem begins in fuzz and what is caught on the grass. Maybe the poem begins in contrasts. Maybe the poem begins in unlikely libraries. Maybe the poem has a delicate start. Maybe the poem begins in attempts at beauty in a harsh landscape. What if a poem begins in shared words and generosity and a willingness to reach beyond the self? What if the poem begins with the alphabet and the imagination? What if a poem begins in the wild, breaking through? What if a poem begins in a game, a leap, a jump, a hoop? What if a poem begins with a structure and a frame and everything that is in and outside the frame? What if a poem begins outside the frame and moves into the frame and then back out again? What if the poem begins inside or outside or somewhere in between or somewhere unknown? What if a poem begins in shadow and silhouette and outlines? What if a poem begins in the space between you and me as we navigate and get closer to one another? What if a poem is about closeness and wanting to draw in, to narrow the space between us? What if a poem begins in that space?